Following the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, many museums and institutions tried to ennoble themselves by organizing exhibitions of artists belonging to minority groups, which could have been well-intended but turned out quite problematic. It's not the first time that a stream of acritical performative liberal propaganda has invaded those spaces. In 1984, the MoMA hosted an exhibition called Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinity of the Tribal and the Modern. The focus of the show was a primitive feeling, characterized by features such as a use of rough or natural materials, a ritualistic attitude, ecological concern, archaeological inspiration, certain techniques of assemblage, a conception of the artist as shaman, or some familiarity with the mind of primitive man and his science and mythology. Historian James Clifford points out these topics as stereotypical themes associated with artifacts production in 20th century colonies. Curiously, these criteria have been adopted again in nowadays calls for artists and in institutional art programs involving minorities. It could be accidental, but my impression is that overall the thematics of these exhibitions are racially biased. Author and performer Olivier Marbouf asserts that there is a pre-scripted scenario that minorities must submit to. In the art field, Black and racial people have to be cool, queer, and they have to obey a certain standard of what is the desirable body at the moment. However, what if the artist with ideal features refuses the invitation from an art institution? What if their research does not match the museum's expectations? If the institution's renowned interest in minorities is a way to deal with racism or queerphobia, other questions could be raised. Racism affects the whole population. By that I mean that having colonizers and slave-owning ancestors is not a pleasant experience for newer generations, and they absolutely need to find a healthy way to deal with this heritage. Or as feminist writer Bell Hooks suggests, the assumption that the crisis of African Americans should or can only be addressed by us must also be interrogated. Much of what threatens our collective well-being is the product of dominating structures. Racism is a white issue as much as it is a black one. Moreover, do black people really exist? Of course, they do, but the definition of one's race varies depending on each country's regulations. In the USA, racial classifications are based on parental heritage, while in Brazil they depend on skin color and are influenced by the perception of self and the perception of others. People who identify as whites are at the top of the class system, while those who identify as blacks are at the bottom. This is quite a unique case, but the line between these so-called races is not fixed and universal. In opposition to this fluid conception of identity, nowadays liberal politics seem to have adopted the essentialist approach of Enlightenment social philosophy. As, in my opinion, their aim is once again to identify natural and essential human characteristics which could serve as the foundations for social explanation and moral values. Foundations which were thus supposed to be universally applicable and authoritative, to use the words of Professor Sean Sayers. This is why the Enlightenment's passion for liberty, equality and fraternity ended up producing the terror. As advised in transgender Marxism, it is necessary to insist on the particular liberation of individuals, keeping in mind liberation cannot reliably be embodied by individuals alone empowering their way in the world. It is essential to go beyond the failures of liberal feminism and a queer politics which emphasizes diversity, inclusion, and tolerance precisely because it raises the possibility of resistance to liberal cross-class cooptation, and distinguishes itself from reductionist invocations of class. All the racial and gender distinctions popularized by identity politics and recently included in the museum's political agenda prevent the rise of solidarity between artists, especially the ones belonging to the lower classes. Author Christine Louis Ditsolli specifically opposes identity politics because it imitates racist ideas and denying our individuality. It imposes the idea that, simply as a result of our common physical identities, I should feel a greater political solidarity with them, than with humans with other physical characteristics but who may share my political opinions. The reason political affinities are so important is cleared by the philosopher Mark Fisher. He said once workers realize the problem is capital, not them. Once they stop competing against one another and realize they have a common enemy, capital, this is when they're going to have agency. So let's abandon identity-based labels and unionize. Let's refuse undignifying unpaid jobs. and adopt self-driven critical thinking, and a good dose of tolerance towards each others.